Hey, welcome to Pagitt Radio. Segment 2, we're going to be joined by Clay Morgan. Clay is the author of a book called Undead, and it's our Halloween edition. Happy Halloween, sidekick.
Before you call him, can
Victoria.
I tell you my idea for if we were dressing up as Doug Pagitt Radio, what our costumes would be?
Yes, how would this
You
ever
would
happen?
be Xena, warrior princess. I think you'd make a great Xena.
I would be a warrior princess.
Yeah, and I would be the sidekick, Gabrielle. I think I'd be a really cute Gabrielle.
I don't know anything about that show.
You don't know Xena?
I don't.
Warrior
Isn't that
wow.
Isn't
Oh,
that
boy.
fascinating that someone wouldn't know
that
about
just
Xena?
turned my
Really?
whole world. Yep.
You would think I would have watched that show.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I
Thanks.
think you would
Thanks
have
for thinking
passed
so.
by it at least.
Speaking of TV shows.
Hello.
Hey, Clay Morgan, this is Doug Pagitt.
Hi, Clay.
Hey, Doug.
How are you? Clay, you're
I'm
on the
doing
show,
good.
and you're joined by Victoria, the sidekick here on the radio program.
Hey, happy Halloween.
Hey, Victoria. I've been listening to you guys. Thanks for calling.
Well, we have been we have been ranting. I don't know if you've heard that, but I had a little political meltdown.
Tis the season.
Oh, it is the season, but I want to be undead, and you have a book entitled Such Things. And for those who don't know, there is a big craze that is happening in pop culture with The Walking Dead and whole zombie sort of movement in and of itself. And you have tried to tap into those sensibilities, haven't you?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I genuinely like watching monster, scary movies. Always kind of have since I was a kid, watching some of those things in the 80s. And I started thinking a couple years ago that Christianity kind of owns the stories of dead people coming back to life.
Yeah.
And so how can two things merge?
And what what is it about that? Before we, I mean, the book is called Undead, and it's it's not just about zombies. It's primarily not about zombies. It's really about people thinking about their own the kind of life that they actually want to lead. But that's, I guess, part of what all zombie narratives are about. And I know that I'm a big fan of the show Walking Dead, and that's clearly what that's about. It's not about dead people. It's about how do the people who are alive want to live.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it, do you think, about death narratives that become so powerful for people?
Yeah, well, you're right. The book is primarily about life. You know, we have to talk about death to make sense out of life.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the popularity of things like zombies or even vampires, and I like The Walking Dead too, there's a few reasons why we're compelled by these stories. And I think it hits close to home when you talk about zombies. They don't look like some kind of, blue creature with fangs. They wear dockers and hair curlers, and they look like us, but they're the ugly representative of what happens to us when we're dead. And it's kind of this outward manifestation of maybe how we feel on the inside sometimes. So I play around with that metaphor, and when you watch a show like The Walking Dead, look at what happens to the characters and their moral compass and their values when they are faced with death all around them.
Mm-hmm.
So you could apply that to, living in a world where the economy is bad, or maybe spirituality is lost, or true meaning, most of all, is just not something a lot of people have found. And so a lot of us feel empty inside, and we're wondering what is missing, and we kind of shamble around all hollow-like.
And how do you so in the Christian narrative, because for a lot of people, Christianity tends to avoid those kinds of emotions, right? Like a lot of Christian conversation and culture is like success oriented, or getting the most out of your life, or singing happy songs and that kind of thing. How do you see that notion of this living with the reality of death, internal, like, either it's long-term spiritual death, or sort of the spirit of a person sort of, dying, or physical death. What are your thoughts on that as you've been thinking about dead people and death narratives inside of Christianity?
Oh, you're right, man. When I go look at the bookshelf, I'm thinking I should have read a book called 7 Steps to Leading a Happy, Fulfilled Life. If I really wanted to, if I wanted to be a breakout author, that's the way I'd go.
Yeah.
And I think there's some people who are hesitant to pick up the book because maybe they just don't like zombies and they think that's what the book is about all the time. It's not at all. Or they just think, ooh, icky, a book about death. And so that's why I thought it was important to really use humor and try to get people, to even laugh throughout these pages and to see some really cool stories along the way. But you're right. In Christian circles, there's a lot of people that would say, well, if you're really Christ-filled, you wouldn't be depressed, or if you really were walking in God's light, you wouldn't be hurting the way you are. And these ridiculous notions that Christians aren't going to feel that emptiness and that longing, even though it's all through the characters of the Bible and the people who are trying to follow God throughout history. So, death is the big thing that's hanging out there we don't like to talk about. But as I said, it's about being dead inside. Are we really alive, or are we just kind of existing and going through day-to-day motions, which is what some of those people in the church are doing. They might act happy on Sundays, and I've been that person. But when I left church, the smile faded, and I was not really feeling fulfilled.
Right.
So do you think that's what a lot of those death narratives are about, or bringing people back to life in the Jesus narrative, that's about challenging or encouraging us to think about ways in which we need to be brought back to life?
Totally. And I talked about, I think probably the most famous story in the Bible is Lazarus.
Yeah.
Aside from Jesus, that one's kind of a big deal. But Lazarus, he's the guy that was actually in the tomb for all those days, and it's just so shocking. To even touch a corpse was unbelievable in the Jewish culture. And by Lazarus, Jesus has other people touching the corpse. But I talk about some of those tombs that we find ourselves in emotionally or spiritually, the emotional tombs that trap us, like depression or anger, or maybe a spiritual tomb to talk like doubt or confusion. And that's another thing that Christian circles don't deal with well a lot of times, doubts and questions. And we need to embrace that, especially with sticky subjects.
So talk a little bit about that. Like if, because, your book's subtitle is Reborn. No. Let me get it right. Revived, Resuscitated, and Reborn. It's not. Talk a little bit about the call of the book. Is it a book to suggest or to say or to imply that that death is this bad thing, that if you're dead on the inside, you should not be that way anymore? Or talk to us a little bit about how you tell the story of the role of darkness and sadness and things dying in you, because everyone I know who takes their life and spirituality seriously, like they don't just want to overcome the death that they've experienced, whether it's in relationships or their hope for the future, or people that they've known and loved, that they've had to incorporate death into their lives in some significant ways. So what do you do in the book with that? Do you say to people like, yeah, if you're dead on the inside, don't be that way anymore?
Well, that would be, I think, a pointless call to action to tell anybody to fix it yourself, because we can't. That's the ultimate call, is to say it's okay that we feel this way, because it's part of human nature. Death is part of existence. But the great thing is that there is hope. We see God's transforming power in the miracles. We see it physically and literally in the ancient narratives. But when we talk about actually being transformed from within, we're never going to be perfect in this existence. But we can definitely feel a new sense of life, a rebirth, as you said, and that's the exciting call about all of this. But no, we'll never be able to fix it ourselves. Yet we have a culture that tries to sell life. We try to sell eternal life through surgeries and gyms and pills and vitamins, and all those things are, okay, but they're not the answer. They're not the ultimate answer. As you said, when a relationship dies, or a job or a career dies, or something like that, we're reeling, and we need someone to come alongside of us and say, I know you're hurting, because I felt that way too, and it does get better. It can get better, but you're not going to be able to work yourself out of it alone, because that's where we really die, is when we're alone, and when we try to get through it ourselves in the darkness, and that's where we're most vulnerable to deception and that lie that says we're really not worth anything. and there really is no point, there really is no meaning, and then we just shrivel up and we're dead maybe 10, 20 years before our funeral ever happens.
Mm-hmm. You know, there's this interesting narratives, right, in the Gospels, and as you mentioned, there's the Lazarus one, but then there's no way for a Christian person or somebody who knows the Christian story to read the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John accounts of Jesus and not know that death is coming, right?
Mm-hmm.
They know that Jesus' death is sort of imminent, and that it's a big part of the story. And for many of us, and maybe you find yourself in the same category, the death of Jesus is not the whole point, right? And there's a lot of people for whom Jesus' death is sort of the focus of everything. But a lot of us want to say, but look, there's resurrection, right? Like the life of God that overcomes even death, that even death can't separate us from the love and the care of God, is this really, really compelling story. And I find myself very, very attuned to that part of the story, and I want to tell that part of it. But then there's this interesting thing where Jesus is saying to Peter, and I think that the role of Jesus as sort of the formulator of faith, and Peter is one of the original proclaimers of that faith to continuing generations, that he says to Peter, here's what's going to happen to you. Right now, you're alive and you go where you want, you can see where you want to go. But when you get older, you're going to be blind, and you're going to be led by people who are going to take you to a place that you don't want to go. And then the narrator of that gospel in John says, and this was Jesus describing the kind of death that Peter was going to experience. So somehow there's this sense that death lives in the story, and that we shouldn't overly romanticize death via resurrection. You know what I mean? I mean, that was kind of a long, convoluted bit, but I find myself, because I don't want like just the death of Jesus to be the culmination of the Jesus story, but I think that even people like me might use resurrection or being reborn or resuscitation or revived as sort of an escape hatch out of it. And I wonder if those stories of people like Peter and others aren't included, so that the Christian community doesn't only tell the story of resurrection, but also truly tells the story of death.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things about that. Number one, if Jesus was just someone who died, then he's just another dead guy. You know, Paul says if Jesus is not raised, then our faith is useless. The entire Christian movement is pointless. There is a focal point on his resurrection, and you're right. Those individuals who followed him, they had to face that in their own way, and it would be just as bad to write a book on 7 ways to find death in your life. You know, that was not really. Then I really wouldn't be selling anything.
Right.
But you know, there's psychologists who say that the great controlling thought in our lives is the subconscious fear of death. And I go back to Ecclesiastes in the book where Solomon said that God has placed eternity in men's hearts, in all of our hearts. And so whether we acknowledge that there is a God or something beyond this life or not, everyone kind of knows there's something more. And we don't find out the answers until we die or cross that door. And so a lot of us just kind of want to stop the conversation there. So, you know, when you're talking about believers specifically, it's not a fun thing to read a verse that says something like, you know, if anybody wants to follow me, he must take up his cross.
Yeah.
And to consider that there's this pain for the life of a follower of Christ or something. But let's face it, there's pain in life. It's not something anyone escapes, and there are certain parts of us that will always die. So what I'm trying to do with this book is just point out the overriding theme that there is ultimate life as well. And even for those people who were brought back to life in the New Testament, there's 6 of them, by the way. Jesus is just one of the 6 stories in the book.
Give us the quick recap for people that don't keep the undead narratives by the numbers. So there's Jesus, there's Lazarus. What are the other ones that folks who may or may not be familiar with the Bible would run into?
Yeah, the other two people that Jesus raised from the dead are the daughter of Jairus, the synagogue ruler,
Tabitha.
and the widow.
Tabitha,
That
right?
Tabitha she's in the book of Acts. Peter was used
I
to
thought
raise
her
her
name
from
was
the dead.
Tabitha too. Okay.
No, and the little girl?
Yeah.
I don't think the little girl's name is Tabitha. I don't think we know her name.
Okay.
And then there was a widow in the town of Nain. Only Luke tells her story. That might be my favorite one.
Oh.
She's just a desperate woman. She's this outcast, and it's such a great story. It just shows, for people who think that Christianity today is sexist or homophobic or just constantly trying to oppress the outsiders, whatever's going on in current religion, this shows what Jesus was about. If we're following his style, he went to the outcasts, he went to the broken, and he went to people who felt like there was no room for them in the organized mess of religion. And the last one is the student named Eutychus. I call him the student. He's a young guy who falls out a window. You might remember that.
Yeah. We just ironically we just talked about that last night in a group that I was in. I mean, who talks about that? Acts chapter
Paul,
20. I now know. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. So you see these people, and here's the thing: those 5 individuals, they were only resuscitated because they had to die again. And I don't think they walked around saying, "Oh man, this stinks. I got to die again." They pretty much spent their life probably pretty excited that they were giving a second chance at life. And that's where we can find ourselves. We can say, you know what? I'm not ultimately going to be resurrected until some time in the future, but I can be reborn and resuscitated right now, and I can find a new life while I'm walking around at my workplace, my house, my neighborhood, and with my family.
So obviously, the book isn't seven steps to a richer life.
Right.
The people you've talked to who've read the book, whether it's in churches or other places, how are they receiving it? What are they telling you is the effect of the book, or what are people liking about it?
Well, the two sides of it are people who are in the church and people who are not. I'll tell you, the most exciting response is for people who say, "I'm not really into religion. I don't really want to go to any churches, but this book made me see a side of God that I've never thought about." And for those people, they're finding it inspiring. They're finding it encouraging that maybe churches aren't as scary or against them as they hoped or thought. And within the church, it's a challenge because my style of storytelling is to basically every other chapter talk a little bit about how much of a screw up I am. Because I'm not a pastor, I'm not a theologian, I'm a writer, and I've struggled with everything that's in this book. And people find comfort in knowing that they're not alone in what they're going through. So it's been a response that's been encouraging. They've been inspired, and quite frankly, people don't know these stories. They're just some of the coolest stories ever told, and there's never been a book that really pulled them all together. I was surprised to find that out.
Well, talk a little bit about that. What do you mean it's hard for people because you're not a pastor or something else and you're a writer? You mean you find people who are committed to churches not being open to the kind of real life vulnerability that you share in the book about being a fairly ordinary human being that does most things kind of halfway well and the other things not so well? Or what is it about that?
Well, the big buzzwords, last few years have been transparency and authenticity.
Yeah.
And but I really do go to a church that's awesome, and I have a pastor who gets up front, and he's a real person. He doesn't try to pretend. But so many of us in our exposure to religious organizations, we've seen that facade where people pretend, like you said, there's no problems. We're not supposed to talk about certain things that must. It's almost comical that churches want to put stuff in the darkness when the whole religion is based on the light. But yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right. People want to know that they're not alone. They want to know that there are other people struggling with doubt, with different emotional problems, and that they don't have it all together. And so, if anything else, this book is an encouragement. And yeah, we can laugh about it. So, I don't know, maybe not too many people write humor books about death, but I tried.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good point too. Is that you've tried to write a book that engages in a serious topic, and therefore using humor is a legitimate way. Because for some people, humor is only appropriate on topics that aren't serious. Like, it's a curious way that people tend to think about the use of humor. Right. You know, like at funerals and other things, that there's people who think, well, no, this is like the ultimate seriousness, so humor doesn't have a place here. And that's a I know we're not, this isn't, you know, we're not going to have a conversation about the theories of humor, but the idea that something's importance and its lack of humor are somehow correlated is a funny way for people to think about it.
Like politics, my goodness, can we please get something funny to happen? You know, it's so tense and uptight,
but not for another 6 days, because people like me are going into panic attacks, and I'm not familiar with these emotions, so it's killing me right now.
Here's a great example, Doug. I was left at a funeral home when I was 4 years old, right?
Seriously?
So I tell this story, and it's been one of the most popular stories in the book, because, I mean, literally this happened. My family accidentally rode off and, left little Clay at the funeral home with a corpse and strangers.
Okay,
and,
like were there a lot of kids in your family, or were your parents particularly distraught at this moment? What?
Well, there were actually two older sisters, and we had one of those big old station wagons in the 1980s where no seatbelt laws, so there was always kids laying in the back somewhere, you know. So my sisters must have told my mom that I was somewhere back there, and off the family rolled away. And meanwhile, I'm wandering around a funeral home trying not to pee myself. You know, that was a wonderful story. But it's a funny funeral home story. You don't hear those too often. And I kind of set the tone for the book with that type of story. But I've always been around death. I don't know. I worked in a cemetery. It wasn't something my family hid. We didn't, you know, keep the kids away from the funeral home. And death is a part of life, I learned early on, but doesn't make it fun. It doesn't take the hurt away. Mm-hmm. But we can bring some levity to these intense situations.
Mm-hmm. And isn't it, I mean, as somebody who likes to use humor, for you as an author who wants to use humor as a part of conveying things of importance, isn't it a little frustrating that the Bible is so limited on that emotion? Like, there might be times where you say, well, if you really knew the original language, you would sort of pick up the word play of what's going on here. But it's not a collection of writings, the Bible, that is rife with the use of the humorous part of our human experience. Isn't that kind of just a shame? I mean, just sort of too bad. Doesn't it reinforce that idea?
It's hard to see how funny some of those encounters are throughout Scripture without understanding the culture of the time. And like you said, most readers don't have that. And even I have to really work to find some of those things, because I'm not a scholar like a person who speaks Hebrew or Greek or anything. But yeah, if you look at the typical Christian living shelf at a bookstore, it is not a laugh riot. I mean, could we please have some more comedy or
right.
You know, it's okay to laugh. I imagine Jesus was a huge laugher. You know, he would probably do little things and play jokes on Peter, like, you know, give him a raccoon tail or something. And I could just see those guys just cracking up walking along the road. So we just don't get that enough, and people are too serious. It's okay to see the joyful side, which laughter is a part of the joyful life we're talking about here. And I wish there was more of that.
Yeah. So okay. So let's just. I mean, you as a writer, and Victoria is also a professional poet. What is it, do you think, about that genre of religion where it gives us, you know, Jesus as angry, which you see that one, Jesus as heartbroken, Jesus weeping. I mean, even there's even a famous phrase connected to Lazarus, as it turns out, you know, that Jesus wept. But you don't. People like you and I, Clay and Victoria, we have to imagine that. I'm sure Jesus was like a real person, and, you know, I mean, like, you know, thought something was funny. But that religious, the collection of those religious stories doesn't use that emotion as a way to convey things of importance. That is curious to me. And I don't know, I mean, you know, maybe I can just write it off as a cultural thing, but boy, it has sure impacted the way that people, the permission that people feel for their religion, and maybe for other things of seriousness too. Because I don't see why, if something's important, that seriousness is the prime means of communication of things that are important. Like that pairing is a funny.
Because when somebody drones on really seriously, it always makes you remember it so well.
Yeah, because it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't really make it more attachable or something.
Right.
Yeah, than something funny. It's a very interesting thing. So do you struggle with that at all when you're trying to write as a thoughtful humorist?
Yeah, well, I think what it is, and maybe it was the same in the first century. There's this fear of irreverence. Oh, is there a line, and am I about to offend? If not offend people, am I about to somehow diminish the message?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
And so a lot of people probably struggle with that kind of fear. And when I wrote a book about zombies and Jesus, I expected some backlash anyway.
Yeah.
It's just, there's just people who, first of all, think that if I even turn on The Walking Dead, I'm probably going to hell or something, But beyond that, yeah, I think it's a line a lot of people are afraid to toe.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think about it, and I always, if I think I'm pushing a button, I try to ask some friends for feedback before I put something out there. I do a lot of writing on the web and freelance work, but at the same time, it is a part of the very fruit of the Holy Spirit. There's this joy. There's this joyful life, and I don't imagine Jesus moped around his entire life, and we know he didn't.
Yeah,
because that wouldn't have attracted tens of thousands of people. Think about charismatic people. Who is it that you love to be around, and why do you love to be around them? Jesus had a lot of those characteristics. So I'm sure he could tell a good story, and he could tell a good joke, and he was probably just so happy when those kids were bouncing on his knee. And there's that side that it is not hard for me to imagine.
Yeah.
Because God gives us joy. He is the source of all that is good.
Yeah, and I hope you're right. I hope that's true because I think you're right on the thing of reverence that people want their when you're talking about God, people don't want to you don't want to screw that one up, right? Is what a lot of people think about. Which I think when you're talking about God, there's a lot of grace. Yeah. So feel free. It's unbreakable is the way I look at it. But for a lot of people, that's not how they see it. They really want to make sure it's sort of done right.
Sure.
But in the history of Judaism and Christianity, you have reverence being wrapped in extreme wealth, right? Like temples and sacrifice and so on. You have animal sacrifices. You have human exclusion. Like you have wars. Like you have all this stuff that you'd think like, wow, that's a curious thing to wrap reverence within.
Yeah.
And then humor gets set aside as if, well, you want to be really careful that you don't that you don't become irreverent in a system built around animal sacrifices. Like, oh my gosh, like seriously, like humor's somehow worse than a system like that. So it is. I'm really sort of just riffing now off of your comments earlier, but it is a curious absence in the like across the board, right? For people who know that the Bible is a collection of 66 books that are categorizing, a few thousand years of recorded of recorded writings. Like it's got a real breadth to it, and sure seems that like portraying leaders as people with quick wits or that are fun or funny or something else is curiously absent. So I would imagine that someone like you who wants to take on a topic that people think is a bit risque, either deadness or the zombie comparison, kind of that pop culture lens, which probably wasn't just a pop culture of the first, well, certainly wasn't just a pop culture of the 21st century, was that the whole notion of the undead was a big deal, I'm sure, in the first century and in Egyptian culture and early Mesopotamian culture and all that as well. So it's probably, it's certainly not just ours. But you've sort of then combined that idea of like, undeadness, pop culture-ness, and humor. I mean, not that you've tried to write a New York Times bestseller, but I could see a lot of religious people being like, man, that's a different genre of book than one that I'm used to.
Yeah. Well, I look at it this way. There is no individual or organization that is ever going to do anything impactful without offending some people.
Huh.
You just know it. I mean, I'm sure you've offended your share of people. So
not until today. It was earlier today. I started down that road.
And so, it happens, and I made the decision along with my publisher, who I'm glad that Abingdon gave me the opportunity to be my quirky self, and we said, we would rather offend some religious people than turn away maybe a potential seeker. And there's people who read this book and they're like, well, this is all Jesus-y and stuff. I'm not into that, and that's fine. There's people who are like, well, I'm not going to read anything about Scripture if it mentions a zombie, and there's that side of it too. Yeah. So it's more for the thoughtful person who wants to know if there's something more in life, or who wants to know why are they so into movies and TV shows, and what do we make of these monsters, and what do they mean for us spiritually? We talk about that in the book. But at the same time, to still have that faith in God at the end of the day. And I put it this way: there are millions of people not going to churches, and their entire supernatural exposure is through entertainment. And so they walk out of a movie theater and they say, well, I wonder what would happen if dead people really came back to life.
Yes.
That's a perfect opportunity for a believer to step in and say, well, dead people have been reported to come back to life, and there's this guy Jesus who was one of those people, and what does that mean now in the 21st century?
Yeah, and so you've picked this title for the book, Undead, which is a little different than Alive, right? Like in the zombie narratives, right, in the zombie nomenclature, being undead is a little different than being alive.
Yeah.
And is that? I mean, I'm not saying you have to have a big theory about that, but were you using that phrase particularly? Like, is that different than coming back to life, being undead?
Right. Well, it is a play on words, and it's a play on the idea. So we tell people to get undead, and that could just mean buy the book, But it also means it also means get undead, get away from this shambling existence. And like you said, an undead creature is a living being that isn't quite there. There's no real life inside of this animated person. And so how many of us are like that? How many of us are alive, or I should say existing, but we're just not completely alive?
Now, it was really just scheduling coincidence that on All Hallows Eve we had you on about Undead, and I thought it sort of worked well. But how has the approaching Halloween and Halloween conversations, how does that interface with the book and what you're doing now and promoting the book and thinking about it? Is this prime Halloween conversation, or are you trying to have does the Halloween happening sort of detract a little bit because people will think, well, it's not Halloween anymore, so why would that book be interesting to me?
That's a great question, and there's two thoughts I have on that. It typically has been in a lot of past years that we have Halloween, we focus on scary movies and costumes for 30 days, and then we kind of put that away until next year. Yeah,
because we have a pilgrim and then a baby Jesus narratives that are coming for the next 2 months.
Yeah. But horror, the horror genre, first of all, is just taking over culture. It's everywhere now. Television programs and just this fascination with the supernatural. It's everywhere 24/7, it seems, as far as the culture is concerned. But again, this book is about life and people coming back from the dead and resurrection. So, we could talk about it well into the Easter season very easily because it's really a book that it looks cool on a shelf during Halloween time when people are looking for fun horror stories, but it really, the meaning of it lives when we really focus on the resurrection of Jesus, which should be every day, but we'll have Easter Bunny month too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I didn't think of that. Well, that's Clay Morgan. Clay, thanks for being on the show. The book is called Undead, Revived, Resuscitated, and Reborn. Do you think it's the only book to be published using resuscitated in the title or in the subtitle?
I don't know. There's probably some medical journal out there, but
Yeah. I mean, I did have to look at that
definitely
word and
challenging.
I don't know that I've ever read the word resuscitated, and I was hoping, hoping that I've heard that word. It's funny to see it. So, Revived, Resuscitated, Reborn, Undead by Clay Morgan. Clay, thanks for the book and thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Clay.
I had a great time. Thanks so much, guys.
Yeah, right on. You can buy that book, Clay. They can buy that book at all the places where they buy fancy books. Is that right?
All the places where they have fancy books, and there's a website that makes it easy. It is claywrites.com. That's WRITES, and they can go to the Undead page.
As in Clay Writes books. So Clay Writes, yeah, you can connect with them on claywrites.com and also over on Facebook, and we'll put a link to it on the Doug Pagitt Facebook page too. Hey, thanks again, Clay, and congratulations on the book.
Thanks, Doug.
All right, see you later, buddy. All right, hey, thanks for listening. We went a little long today, but you got a bonus because I felt so badly about being so mean in the first segment.
Was that what that was about?
I don't like myself.
I'm sitting here thinking, wow, we're usually done by
killing
now.
time. I know. I
I
know,
had
but
poems to write, dude.
I know. I just don't. I mean, I'm glad to tell the truth. I think sometimes, but what I don't like is I don't like feeling that way.
No.
I don't want to feel this way anymore. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired.
It's too bad we don't have a right on right now.
Oh, we totally need a right on. but I'm waiting. We're like I'm waiting till later.
Let's give the American people a right on next week.
Next week,
Do the right thing, people.
Do the right thing. Do the next right thing. Whatever that is to you. So thanks for putting up with us one way or the other. Appreciate it. Of course, sidekick Victoria. Thanks so much. We'll be back next week. Talk to you then, friends. See you. Bye.